Captain Noah Vance stood in the command center of the Ravager, his eyes fixed on the massive screen that displayed the vast emptiness of space. The steady hum of the warship's engines was a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. A few seconds ago, the fleet had been poised for a routine patrol. Now, they were on the brink of annihilation. "Sir, incoming fire!" Lieutenant Walker's voice cut through the silence, tight with urgency. Vance didn't flinch. His gaze remained unbroken, eyes tracing the alien fleet on the screen, hundreds of massive ships, sleek and deadly, floating like shadows in the dark of space. The Vlari, one of the most feared empires in the galaxy, had come for them, and they weren't here to negotiate. "How long?" Vance asked, his voice calm, almost detached. 5 seconds, maybe less. They're already firing their weapons." The crew moved like clockwork, efficiently executing procedures with practiced precision. Vance wasn't just their commander, he was their lifeline, their shield. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "Shields up. All hands brace for impact," Vance ordered, his tone unwavering. But inside, a cold calculation stirred. He knew what they were up against: technologically superior weapons, faster-than-light drives, and an enemy fleet that outnumbered them 10-1. As the first blast struck the Ravager, a shudder reverberated through the ship, and alarms blared. The vibrations ran deep, a sickening reminder that this was no drill. "Shields are holding, but just barely, sir," Lieutenant Walker said, eyes darting over the control panels. "How much longer?" Vance pressed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Maybe another minute before they give out," Walker replied, sweat beading on his forehead. Vance's mind raced. They had moments, perhaps less, before the ship would be torn apart by the relentless barrage. His crew had been trained for this, to face overwhelming odds. But this time, it wasn't a training exercise. It was real. "All right, listen up!" Vance's voice rang out, sharp as a knife. "Prepare the secondary defense systems. We're not just going to survive this, we're going to make sure they regret it." He turned towards the communications officer. "Send a message to Admiral Shaw. Tell him to hold the line. We're buying time for reinforcements." The officer nodded, fingers flying over the keys. "Message sent, sir." He turned back to the main screen, watching as the enemy fleet slowly closed in. They weren't just attacking, they were closing in for the kill. The Vlari had no intention of letting them escape. Captain Vance's lips tightened into a thin line. The odds were stacked against them, but humanity's greatest asset wasn't firepower or tech, it was their unpredictability, their adaptability. The Vlari had underestimated them once before, and they were about to make that mistake again. He glanced at his tactical officer, Lieutenant Daniels, who was working feverishly at the console. "Daniels, can we override the enemy's targeting system?" Vance asked, eyes narrowing. Daniels looked up, meeting Vance's gaze with determination. "We can try. It'll be risky, too much interference, but maybe we can disrupt their comms, knock them off course for a few minutes." Vance considered the plan for a moment. "Do it." There was no hesitation. Daniels moved fast, fingers dancing over the holographic interface. For a moment, everything felt still. And then, the hum of the systems changed. The Ravager trembled again, but this time, it wasn't from an incoming blast. It was from something else. "Are we hitting them?" Vance demanded. Daniels didn't answer at first, eyes glued to the screen. "Yes, sir," he said finally, voice tight with disbelief. "Their fleet's targeting system is malfunctioning. They are firing at each other." Vance allowed himself the slightest hint of a smile. "Now that's more like it." On the screens, explosions rippled across the enemy lines. The Vlari were scrambling, their massive ships firing indiscriminately. In moments, chaos reigned within their ranks. What had once been a precise, coordinated attack had devolved into confusion. But that was only the first part of the plan. "Lieutenant Walker, I need full power to the engines. Get us moving, now!" "Turning us into the line of fire, sir?" Walker asked, incredulous. "Exactly. We're going to use their overconfidence against them. The Ravager lurched forward, pushing through the barrage of fire with a surprising turn of speed. The human ship's maneuvers were unpredictable, erratic, completely unlike anything the Vlari had encountered. The alien fleet, so accustomed to facing predictable tactics, struggled to adapt. "Sir, the Vlari flagship is adjusting its trajectory," Daniels said. "They're targeting us directly now." Vance's eyes flicked to the screen. The flagship was massive, far more advanced than any human ship, its weapons capable of annihilating entire fleets. But Vance wasn't worried. He had a different plan in mind. "Fire the secondary weapons! Aim for their engines!" he barked. "Firing now," Walker responded. The Ravager's cannons fired in a precise sequence, streaking across space to strike the Vlari flagship. Sparks erupted from its hull, a series of small explosions tearing through its outer layers. The ship shuddered, its trajectory beginning to falter. For a moment, the enemy fleet hesitated. The Vlari flagship, crippled by the Ravager's unexpected tactics, was no longer the imposing threat it once was. And then, Captain Vance gave the order that would change everything. "Prepare the weapon." The Ravager's last card was a device older than most of the crew, a relic from Earth's earliest space missions. It hadn't been tested in years, but it was humanity's trump card. With a single push of a button, Captain Vance initiated the activation sequence. Outside the ship, a deep, resounding hum filled the void of space. A shockwave, invisible but deadly, emanated from the Ravager. The Vlari fleet, so confident just moments ago, found themselves struck by a wave of sudden, incapacitating interference. Systems went dark, their ships careening into each other in blind chaos. And that's when the realization hit. They had picked the wrong fleet to fight. The Ravager had emerged from the chaos, its systems flickering back to life as the last remnants of the Vlari fleet drifted in disarray. Captain Noah Vance stood on the bridge, staring at the tactical display, his mind already moving ahead. The battle was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. "Report, Lieutenant Walker," Vance ordered, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the urgency beneath. "Sir, the enemy fleet is disorganized, but they're recovering quickly. Their flagship's still functional, and we've got at least 5 Vlari vessels regrouping," Walker responded, glancing nervously at the console in front of him. Vance didn't react to the news. They were still alive, and that was all that mattered. "We've got their attention now. They'll expect us to retreat or try to hide. Let's give them something they're not prepared for." He turned toward Lieutenant Daniels, who was already tapping commands into the holodeble. "Daniels, how's the damage report?" "Minimal, Captain. We've lost a few auxiliary systems, but nothing critical. The engines are intact, shields are at 50%, and our weapons are still operational," Daniels replied, his face glowing in the light of the control panels. Vance nodded, satisfied. "Good. Let's keep it that way. Now we need to make them think we're vulnerable." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You want us to let them get close?" "Exactly," Vance said, his lips curving into a grim smile. "It's time for them to underestimate us again. Set course toward the debris field. We'll use it as cover." "Understood, sir." "Setting course now." Vance's eyes scanned the tactical display as the Ravager moved toward the scattered remnants of the Vlari ships. The field of wreckage would conceal their movement, and give them a few precious minutes before the aliens could close in again. But it wasn't just about hiding. This was about forcing the Vlari to play by humanity's rules. "Get me Commander Orzak," Vance ordered. The thought of confronting the arrogant Vlari leader felt almost like a personal vendetta at this point. The Vlari had underestimated humanity for the last time. A moment later, the screen flickered, and the image of Commander Orzak appeared. His reptilian features were twisted into a mask of fury, eyes narrowed as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "You've made a grave mistake, human," Orzak's voice came through, cold and venomous. "You've delayed the inevitable. This fleet will crush you." Vance leaned forward, his voice calm but dripping with confidence. "We'll see about that. You're in our territory now. And you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Orzak's lips curled into a sneer, and he turned his attention to something off-screen, barking orders to his subordinates. It doesn't matter what tricks you've used. Our fleet is far superior. Prepare for your extinction. Before Vance could respond, the communication cut off, leaving only the eerie hum of the ship's engines in its wake. The Vlari were stubborn, and that would be their downfall. Daniels, take us into the debris field. Give them a false signal. Make it look like we're damaged beyond repair. Daniels didn't ask questions. Yes, sir. A series of subtle manipulations, expertly executed, made the Ravager appear crippled. The ship's shields were lowered, engines sputtering on low power. The Vlari fleet, observing through their advanced sensors, saw an easy target. They began to close in, as Vance had expected. Now we wait, Vance muttered, eyes fixed on the approaching fleet. There was a certain calm in him, a stillness that came with knowing the inevitable was unfolding just as he had planned. Lieutenant Walker's voice broke through the silence. Enemy fleet is closing, sir. They'll be within range in 30 seconds. Vance nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Activate the decoys. On my mark. Decoys ready, Daniels confirmed. Now. In an instant, the Ravager's sensors overloaded, sending a blinding signal into space. The decoys, small, self-propelled drones, flared to life, scattering in multiple directions. The Vlari, taken by surprise, began to divert their fire toward the decoys, mistaking them for a fully powered human fleet. Now, Lieutenant, Vance ordered. Firing. The Ravager's remaining weapons fired in quick succession, not at the Vlari fleet, but at the wreckage surrounding them. A series of calculated, precise blasts sent debris flying toward the enemy, obscuring their view. The Vlari ships, caught in the debris storm, struggled to maintain control. This is it, Vance muttered, standing up. He could feel the energy of the moment building inside him. The time to strike was now. All hands brace for impact. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, he commanded. The Ravager shot out from the cover of the debris, its engines roaring to full power. The Vlari fleet, still caught in the confusion, attempted to adjust their fire. But they were too slow. The Ravager's sudden movement caught them off guard. Vance wasn't going to wait for them to regroup. Now all guns, fire at their flagship, Vance shouted. The Ravager's weapons lit up, streams of energy cutting through the dark expanse of space. The shots struck the Vlari flagship dead center, sending shockwaves through its hull. The flagship rocked violently, but it didn't fall. Yet. Damage report, Lieutenant Daniels? Vance asked, his voice still steady despite the violence unfolding. Their shields are down, Captain, Daniels replied, his fingers flying over the controls. We've breached their outer defenses. Vance's eyes glinted with cold satisfaction. Now we finish what we started. Prepare for the boarding action. The boarding pods were ready. The plan was simple: cripple the flagship's command center and force the Vlari to retreat. Vance had seen enough of their arrogance. It was time to show them the true power of humanity. Boarding teams, prepare for launch, Vance ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos of the bridge. The first pod launched, piercing the cold emptiness of space with relentless precision. As it rocketed toward the Vlari flagship, Vance watched on the main screen as the pod struck the flagship's outer hull. A small explosion sent a burst of light flashing across the screen. Commander Orzak, this is your final warning, Vance said over the open comms, his voice low but laced with authority. You've underestimated us, and now you'll pay the price. For a moment, there was nothing but silence from the other side. Then, the channel crackled to life once again. Orzak's voice, strained and filled with disbelief, came through. This is impossible. Impossible for you, maybe, Vance replied coldly. But not for us. The battle was far from over, but the Vlari had made their mistake. They had picked the wrong fleet to fight. The Ravager had dealt the first significant blow to the Vlari. But Captain Noah Vance knew that this was no time for celebration. The Vlari fleet was crippled, but far from defeated. Their flagship was down, but it was still operational. Orzak, like the rest of his species, refused to accept that a human fleet could cause them such damage. It wasn't over yet. "Captain," Lieutenant Daniels said, his voice urgent, "the Vlari are regrouping. Their secondary fleet is en route. We've bought some time, but not much." Vance stood silently, staring at the tactical screen. His mind was working at full capacity, calculating every possible move. His crew had delivered, but now it was time to press the advantage. They couldn't afford to wait for reinforcements. The Ravager had already taken heavy damage, and the enemy was still too strong. But this was humanity's fight for survival, and he would not back down. "Lieutenant Walker," Vance said, his voice steady, "what's the status on our weapons and shields?" "Shields are at 40%, Captain. Weapons are still functional but not at full power. We've lost several primary weapon systems in the last engagement," Walker responded, eyes fixed on his console. "It's going to be tough to hold them off with just secondary systems." Vance nodded. "We'll have to make do. Daniels, I need you to reroute power from auxiliary systems to shields and weapons. We need everything we've got focused on defense and firepower." Daniels immediately got to work, fingers flying over the control board. "Rerouting now, Captain. We won't survive another full-on assault," Walker said bluntly, glancing up from his console. "We need a plan, and fast." Vance met his gaze. The situation was dire, but it wasn't hopeless. His thoughts raced, pulling together pieces of a strategy he had learned over years of war. This was going to be a high-risk move, but it was their best chance. "All right, listen up," Vance said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We're going to take the fight to them. We know the Vlari are overconfident and slow to adapt. We use that. Daniels, send out a false distress signal from one of our outer stations. Make it look like we're weak and struggling. The Vlari will think they can easily finish us off." Daniels hesitated, eyeing Vance warily. "Captain, we don't have much left to fake weakness with. We'll be walking into a trap." Vance met his gaze. "We'll make them believe it. We'll use their arrogance to our advantage. If they think we're limping, they'll come for us. That's when we strike." Daniels nodded, eyes narrowing. "Understood. I'll make the adjustments." Vance turned back to the main screen, watching the Vlari fleet slowly advance. The debris field they had used as cover was no longer effective. The enemy had regrouped, and they were closing in with greater force. This was their moment. There was no turning back now. "Prepare all boarding teams," Vance ordered. "We're going to hit them where it hurts." 30 minutes later, the Ravager drifted like a wounded beast, its engines barely functional, shields flickering on the verge of collapse. To any observer, it looked like an easy target, just another human ship about to be overwhelmed by superior firepower. The Vlari didn't know that they were walking into a trap. The Vlari fleet, led by the flagship that was still limping but fully operational, began to close in. Orzak's fleet advanced in a slow, calculated formation, preparing to deliver the final blow. The communications officer picked up the transmission from Orzak's ship. "We have you cornered, human," Orzak's voice crackled over the comm. "Surrender now, and we will make your death quick. Fight, and we will exterminate you to the last." Vance remained silent for a moment, letting the message hang in the air. Then, with icy calm, he responded. "Not today, Orzak. You'll regret underestimating humanity." With that, the Ravager's engines roared back to life, and the ship lurched forward, surprising the Vlari. It wasn't the sudden burst of speed that shocked them, it was the boldness of the move. The human ship, seemingly on the verge of collapse, charged straight toward them. "Full weapons power, now!" Vance shouted. The Ravager unleashed a barrage of secondary firepower, sending a volley of laser fire streaking across the Vlari formation. The first wave of blasts hit their forward ships, creating chaos in their ranks. But Vance knew it wasn't enough. The Vlari flagship, despite being damaged, was still formidable. "Deploy boarding pods," Vance commanded, his hands steady as the ship's automated systems engaged. "Target the flagship," I want those command centers breached. Boarding teams, you are go for deployment. Lieutenant Walker confirmed, his voice strained. The pods are away. The pods shot off the Ravager like missiles, racing toward the Vlari flagship. Each one was packed with highly trained soldiers, armed with advanced gear designed for both infiltration and sabotage. The plan was simple: get inside, plant explosives, and cripple the enemy from within. Lieutenant Daniels, I need a distraction, Vance ordered. Activate the EMP pulse. We need to blind their systems long enough for our teams to breach the ship. EMP pulse ready, Daniels said, his fingers flying over the controls. Firing now. The EMP pulse fired, sending a wave of electromagnetic energy toward the Vlari flagship. Moments later, its systems went dark. The Vlari fleet faltered, their ships freezing in place as their weapon systems and communications were temporarily disabled. Now's our chance! Vance yelled. The boarding pods collided with the flagship's outer hull, their explosive charges blasting through the thick metal. Soldiers stormed out, cutting through enemy resistance with ruthless efficiency. The Vlari commanders inside scrambled to organize a defense, but it was too late. The humans were already in their heart. On the bridge of the Ravager, Vance felt the shift. The tide of battle had turned. The Vlari, caught off guard by the humans' audacity, were beginning to panic. Their flagship was being torn apart from the inside, and their fleet was in disarray. Sir, enemy flagship is under our control, Lieutenant Daniels reported, his voice tinged with disbelief. We've taken their command center. They're surrendering. Vance's eyes hardened. No surrender. We finish this. The Vlari had thought they could break humanity with brute force. They had underestimated the human will, the ability to turn the tide in the face of certain death. Now, the Ravager was the symbol of their resilience. All units target the remaining fleet, Vance ordered, his voice unshakable. Let's make sure they never forget what happens when they pick the wrong fleet to fight. The final battle was about to unfold, and humanity was about to leave an indelible mark on the galaxy. The silence in the command center of the Ravager was deafening. For a moment, Captain Noah Vance allowed himself to breathe. His fingers gripped the armrests of his chair as he watched the tactical screen, the aftermath of the battle unfolding before him. The Vlari fleet had been shattered, their flagship captured, their will to fight broken. But Vance knew better than to think this was over. He was aware that the Vlari were not just fighting to win, they were fighting for survival. The comms officer's voice broke the stillness. Captain, incoming transmission from the Vlari fleet commander. It's Orzak. Vance's jaw clenched. Put it through. Orzak's face appeared on the screen, his features dark with rage. His once imposing figure now looked smaller, diminished. The Vlari had never expected to be in this position, on the back foot, struggling for their very survival. You think you've won, human? Orzak's voice crackled, filled with venom. You've only delayed the inevitable. Our empire will not fall to your pitiful forces. Vance didn't flinch. You're wrong, Orzak. Your empire underestimated us, and now you'll pay the price. Orzak's eyes flashed, his arrogance still trying to surface despite the loss. You think this will break us? We will rebuild, and we will come for you again. Vance's gaze remained cold. This isn't about rebuilding, Orzak. It's about understanding that you picked the wrong fleet to fight. You're too late. This ends now. Before Orzak could respond, Vance cut the transmission, his finger slamming the button. He turned toward his crew, his resolve unyielding. Lieutenant Daniels, can we disable the rest of their fleet without destroying them? Daniels met his gaze, his fingers already working across the control panel. It's possible, Captain. We can use the disruptors to disable their engines and weapons. They won't be able to flee or fight back, but they'll live. Do it, Vance commanded. He turned back to the screen, eyes scanning the now scattered Vlari ships, their systems still recovering from the EMP pulse. They were no longer a threat, they were cornered. An hour later, the Ravager hovered above the remaining Vlari fleet, now reduced to floating hulks of metal, their engines powerless, their weapons useless. The sight was eerily quiet, as if the stars themselves held their breath in anticipation. "All Vlari's ships are disabled, Captain," Lieutenant Walker reported, his voice steady. "They're not going anywhere." Vance nodded, his gaze lingering on the screen. The victory was complete, but it felt anticlimactic. The Vlari were humiliated, but Vance understood the gravity of this moment. They had fought not just for survival, but for the future of humanity. This was a turning point in the galaxy. "Send a transmission to the fleet," Vance ordered, his voice clear. "Let the Vlari know we're not their prey. Let them know what happens when they underestimate humanity." On the bridge of the Ravager, the crew watched as Vance's message broadcasted across the stars. "We have proven ourselves today," Vance's voice rang out, strong and unwavering. "We are not a species to be taken lightly. We fight not because we seek war, but because we will defend our home, our people, and our future. The Vlari have learned that the hard way. This galaxy is vast, but it belongs to those who are willing to fight for it." The transmission ended, and for the first time, the crew allowed themselves a moment of relief. But Vance's mind was already turning. The fight against the Vlari might have been won, but the war for humanity's place in the galaxy was just beginning. "Captain," Daniels interrupted, his voice measured. "The Vlari flagship is responding. They've sent us a direct transmission." Vance's brow furrowed. "Put it through." Orzak appeared again, his face a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps fear. "You may have beaten us, human. But this is far from over. The Vlari Empire is vast. This is a mere setback. You will regret this day." Vance leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "I think it's you who will regret underestimating us, Orzak. You're done. The galaxy has seen what we're capable of." For a moment, Orzak said nothing, his eyes flickering with a mix of pride and doubt. Then, he spoke, his voice tight. "You've won the battle, human. But you haven't seen the full extent of the storm you've unleashed." Before Vance could respond, Orzak's transmission cut off, and the screen returned to static. "That's it, Captain," Walker said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "They're finished." Vance looked out into the vastness of space, the distant stars offering no answers. The battle had been hard fought, but it wasn't over. Humanity had struck a blow, but the war for the galaxy had only just begun. "Prepare to return to the fleet," Vance ordered. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." The journey back to the fleet was a quiet one, the crew of the Ravager working in harmony, their movements automatic after days of combat. Vance stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the stars. They had won, no question about it. But something lingered in his mind. Orzak's words. They had defeated the Vlari, yes. But Vance knew that this would not be the last time they faced the might of the Galactic Alliance. It was clear now that the galaxy was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The Vlari might have been the first to challenge humanity's rise, but they wouldn't be the last. The universe was full of dangers, and the humans who had fought back with such ferocity were not finished yet. The transmission to the fleet had made that clear. Vance had declared humanity's dominance over the Vlari, but he had also made it clear that humanity would never back down. Their place in the stars was secured, and no one would be able to forget the moment the aliens realized they had picked the wrong fleet to fight. Vance allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The Ravager had proved the impossible possible. Humanity had fought with everything they had, and had come out on top. The final strike had been delivered, but the story was just beginning. And Captain Noah Vance knew that the next chapter would be even harder. But humanity was ready. They had already shown what they were capable of. And the galaxy would never be the same again.